We begin the Mishnah today on Daf Kov Gimel Amud Beis. Zok the Heilige Mishnah Beis Kor Ofar Ani Moichelach. The seller says he's selling a field in the amount of a Beis Kor Ofar, and then he adds also that it's going to be Midda Bechevel, that it's going to be measured with a rope, meaning that he's selling him exactly the size of a Beis Kor. So in such a case, since he spelled this out clearly, Piches Kol Shuhu, if he sold and it was a drop less than this amount, Yenake, so then the seller has to deduct from the payment. Haisa Kol Shuhu, if he gave him more than this amount, Yachze, so then the buyer has to return it. Now the Rashbam explains that even though we had read it before, that in the case where you sell in a certain measure or a certain weight, and you give either more or less, then the whole thing is a mekach tos, because it's not what you said you're selling. But that, the Rashbam says, is only regarding metaltalin, movable items. But when it comes to a piece of karka, in such a case, it doesn't break the whole sale. But over here, we know that the buyer wants to buy it as is, even if it's a little more or less, and it's just that because he said that it's going to be exact, so therefore you have to give back the amount that was extra, or the seller has to deduct if he gave him less. Sagt the Mishnah Maita, Navim Omar Hein Chaser Hein Yesa. If the seller says, I'm selling you a base Kor Ofar, but then he added, it could be a little bit more, less or a little bit more. So he's telling him that it's going to be approximate, not exactly. So in such a case, Afilu Piches Roiva Lisa, if the amount over here that he's selling is a saw. The Mishnah started off with the case of a base core, but now the Mishnah gives you the ratio of the amount of how much he gave less to the amount of a saw. Every base core is 30 saw, so we're talking over here about just one saw that he sold. So if when the seller sold, he gave less, the amount less was a roiva is a quarter of a kav. Every saw is made up of 6 kav. So if he gave him less of the amount of a saw, and the amount less was a quarter of a kav, that means that it's a 24th less in the whole size of the field. Or he gave him more, a quarter of a kav to the saw. He added a surplus, he gave him more. So in such a case we say, higiyoi, that whatever the buyer got, that's what he got. If he got a little bit more, he can keep it. If it was a little less, he can't have tinus to the seller. That's what he got. And that's why I told him that it's going to be maybe a little more or a little less, approximate, and even if it's not exact. So this is mechila. He's moichel because that's what they made up. However, yoiser mikan, if it's more than a quarter of a kav to a saw, then yasa cheshbon. In such a case, if the buyer got more than the amount that he sold him, and how much more did he get? He got more than a quarter of a kav to the amount of a saw that he's buying, so then he has to make a cheshbon. What's the halacha of yasa cheshbon? Yasa cheshbon means he has to go back to the seller and he has to pay him extra money for the extra amount of the property that he got from him. Okay, now the chiddush over here is that in this case, the seller says to the buyer, the extra piece of the field that I gave you, it's sold, it's yours. You can't now tell me, oh, it's an extra piece, I don't want it, here, take it back. No, the buyer has to buy and keep this field, and he makes a cheshbon of what's the additional amount that he has to pay him for the additional piece of the field. Okay, now the reason for this is, why can't the buyer just come to the seller and say to him, you gave me an extra piece, I don't want it, here, take it back. The answer is because if he's going to tell the seller, take back this little piece of field, if it's too small of a piece of a field, what's the seller going to do with it? It's too small for him to keep, to use, to plant with it. So therefore, it's a big loss for him to just take back this small piece. Therefore, Chachamim were misakin that the buyer has to take that piece of field, and he pays the money for what he gets, for that extra piece, he pays to the seller. The Rashbam says this is zen nene v'zel chaser. The buyer is paying, but he's getting for it. If the seller would have to take it back, for him it would be a big loss. But for the buyer, it's not a loss. So therefore, they were misakin for the benefit of the seller that he shouldn't have to take back this little piece, and he makes a cheshbon, and then he keeps this piece of field. Okay, now let's see it in the words of the Mishnah. Now, mahu machzer loy. What, when he makes a cheshbon, what does the buyer have to return and give to the seller? Mois. He pays him extra money for this piece of field that he got. Now, if the seller agrees, and he says, okay, I'll take back that little piece of field that I gave you that's extra, then machzale karka. Then you can give him back that piece of karka. But it's only if he agrees. But if he doesn't agree, then he doesn't have to take it back. Now here the Mishnah explains the point that I said before. Why do we say that the buyer only gives back money? The reason is, Chacham will masakin this in order to make the koyach of the seller stronger, meaning that he shouldn't lose out over here. Like I mentioned, because if you're going to say that he has to take back that little piece of field, then it's going to come out that he gets back a little piece of field, and what is he going to do with it? It's too small for him to plant or to do anything with it. So therefore, Chacham will masakin that he gives him back money, or he gives him additional money, that is, for this little piece of field that now the buyer will keep as well. Now here, the Mishnah goes on to explain though, okay, just to clarify one thing, it said over here in the Mishnah, the shear of a roiva to a saw. The reason why the Mishnah brings up the case of a saw, the Rashbam says, even though the Mishnah starts off talking about a base core, because it wants to say a chiddush, even when it's a smaller field, much smaller, 30 times smaller, it's just a saw, but nevertheless, a roiva, the amount of a roiva in this small field is considered to be an amount that there's a mechila here. Whether it's more or less of this saw, there's mechila, and the sale stays as is. Okay, that's one point. Another point here is, now to take this roiva l'saw, this ratio of a quarter of a kav to a saw, as I mentioned, it's a 24th of a saw. That's what it comes out to be. So going back to the case of a base core, for a base core, what would be the amount of what we say that up until that amount there's a mechila? If you added a little or was a little less of the sale, it's going to be 7.5 kav to a core. A core is 30 saw. So if for a saw, it's a quarter of a kav, that is the amount that we say that there's a mechila for this. When it comes to 30 saw, which is a core, it comes out to be 7.5 kav. We'll see the Gemara mentions this shear as well. Okay, but now the Mishnah goes on to say this whole idea here that we say yasa cheshbon, this concept that once it's more than a beis roiva, so now you have to return or you have to pay money for it, but you have to make a cheshbon, meaning that the seller can't force the buyer to give him back the buyer, that is, can't force the seller to take back the field. The seller could say, I just want you to give me money. So this was all for the benefit of the seller. Now the Gemara says, or the Mishnah here goes on to say, this is all up to a certain amount of a size of a field. However, she'im shir besad the beis tishakabin. This was all, the point here is, as the Mishnah just explained, because it's a small field. So then, what's the seller going to do if you're going to give him back the small piece? But if he gave him extra, a piece of field now, and he has a leftover extra piece, which is the amount of 9 kav. 9 kav is already a piece of a field that's big enough that you can work in it, you can plant all day in it, and it's already a choshev, it's a significant piece of a field. So over here, if the extra amount that the buyer got was the amount of 9 kav is an amount where the buyer could say to the seller, take back your field. I'm not interested in buying this. And the seller can't, we don't say that for the benefit of the seller that he doesn't have to take back the field. No, it's big enough. It's actually big enough that he takes it back, that he can do something with it. And that's by a field. So as you see here, this shear of Tisha Kabin, so that we had before, as I mentioned, the shearing, this is regarding a core. When it comes to a core, what's the amount that we say that there's mechila? Up to the amount of 7.5 kav. Okay, so now it comes out, according to what the Mishnah says here, the way that Rashbam puts it, that there's 3 different shiurim. There's the shear of up until 7.5 kav. That amount, if the buyer got more than what he bought, then that's mechila. Doesn't have to give it back, you meichel. If it's more than 7.5 kav, there's no mechila anymore. Huh? You don't have to pay. Up until 7.5 kav, including 7.5 kav, it's mechila. That's why he said pichis or yeser mechila. If it's more than 7.5 kav for a core, so then that's, you're not meichel anymore. That's already more than this shear. That's in the ratio of a roiva to a saw. But over here, he's going to have to pay the seller. He can't give him back the field because it's too small for him to do anything with it. So you have to pay him for it. And then once it's extra, it's more, it's the size of a field that's already 9 kav, so over here, you don't have to make a cheshbon anymore. Over here, the buyer just gives back the field to the seller. Those are the 3 categories here. Now, begina, when it comes to a garden, by a garden, it's a smaller size of what's considered to be a significant amount that the seller has to take it back because he could use it. Beis chatzi kav, it's the amount of a half a kav. If the garden, the piece of the garden that he got extra, the buyer got extra, is the size of a half a kav, that's an amount that the buyer can just give back to the seller, and he doesn't have to make a cheshbon to buy it off of him because it's significant enough that he could use. That's according to one opinion. Okay, now according to Rabbi Akiva's opinion, this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion that was brought earlier in the Masechta, in the first Perek, Beis Roiva, by a garden, even a quarter of a kav is big enough that we say that he's able to just give it back without making any cheshbon because it's large enough as a garden to be able to plant separately. This was brought in the beginning in the first Perek when it comes to shutfin that want to divide a field or want to divide a garden. What's the minimum size to be able to force your partner to divide? So by a karka, like we said here, by a soda, it's 9 kav. When it comes to a garden, there was a machlekes. Either it's a half a kav or a quarter of a kav is large enough as a significant area of a garden to plant. So if it's a beis roiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, machsaloi es a karka, he gives back the karka to the seller and he doesn't have to pay for it. He's not forced to buy it off of him. The Mishnah says over here in this case, when the amount that was added, more than what you wanted to buy, was more than a roiva, so there's no mechila on this, and you have to give it back. Not only this roiva you give back, the whole extra you give back as well. The Gemara is going to explain this. Really, the lashon of the Mishnah should be the other way around. What it's saying over here is roiva, up to the amount of a roiva, including a roiva, there's usually mechila on this. And then if it's more than a roiva extra that you got, then there's no mechila on this. So really what the Mishnah means to say is, not only that extra, more than the roiva you have to give back, but once it's extra, you have to give back the whole entire extra. Not only the meiser, but even the whole roiva, that whole extra kav, of a quarter of a kav it is, you have to give it all back, and now you only get the exact amount of what you bought. A sa'ah or a kor, or whatever it is. Okay, the Gemara begins, going back to the beginning of the Mishnah. The Shaila was asked as follows. The Mishnah spoke about 2 cases. One case where the seller said that I'm selling you clearly that it should be exact, like measured with a rope. Another case where he clearly spelled out that it's only approximate, because he said that piches or yeter. Now the question is, what's if beis kor stomemai? If he says, I'm selling you a beis kor, and he doesn't spell out, he doesn't say it's going to be exact, he doesn't say approximate, what do I say then? Do I say that it means that it could be a little more or a little less? Or maybe no, because he didn't spell out a little more or a little less. Maybe it means it has to be exact. Okay, so the Gemara brings the 2 cases of the Mishnah. Toshima. So first, what did it say in the first case of the Mishnah? If the seller says, Beis kor afar, I'm selling you the amount of a beis kor afar, and then he adds that it's going to be exact, measured by a rope. Then pachis kol shuhu, if he gave him a little bit less than this amount, yanake, he has to deduct from the payment. Yes, a kol shuhu, if you gave him a little more, yachze, the buyer has to give it back. So you see, the Mishnah says, if he spelled out clearly that it's going to be exact, then it has to be exact. So from this we keep in medayik, but if it's a case where you just said beis kor afar and you didn't spell out that it should be exact, so then it's as if he spelled out that it could be a little more, a little less, just by stomach. Since he didn't say it's going to be exact, it could be a little more or a little less. That's what it sounds like from the ratio of the Mishnah. Okay, but the Gemara asks, well, from the next case of the Mishnah, you could be medayik the exact opposite. Hey, Meseif, what does this Mishnah say afterwards? That I'm selling you this amount of a beis kor, but it's approximate. It could be a little less or a little more. Then I say, I feel a pichas roiva l'sa, that if it was a little less or more, and the amount up to a quarter of a kav to a saw that's being sold, higiyah. Whatever the buyer got, he got, and there's a mechila for this, and the sale is fully in effect. Now here it says only if he spelled out clearly. He told him that it could be a little more or a little less. So from this I understand the opposite. If he doesn't spell that out, and he's just selling him a beis kor offer, and he doesn't say that it's going to be maybe a little more or a little less, then kimida b'chevel dami. Then it has to be exact, as if he told him that he's selling it to him with an exact amount measured to the inch. So we have a diak from the Reisha, a diak from the Sefer, 2 opposites here. Regarding this case where you just said plain, beis kor offer. Says the Gemara, from the Mishnah, you can't be medayik one way or another. And as the Rashbam explains, the Mishnah here did not say the halachas in this oifen to be medayik regarding stomach. The Mishnah said the halachas where he said befedish that it's going to be exact, or he said befedish and it's going to be hein choter and yeser, chaser and yeter. That is that. So also the Mishnah was saying this. Rashbam explains that it's connected to the next Mishnah on Amud Beis, where the Mishnah is going to talk about a case where the person said both lashonos. He said, in the beginning he said that it's going to be exact, and then in the end he said it's going to be not exact. So the Mishnah wants to explain what happens if he says both lashonos, so therefore it says over here, the two cases in this Mishnah. But you can't be medayik anything from this Mishnah regarding the Iboye when you say beis kor stama, and you don't spell out. Like Gemara brings a Braisa, Toshama, the Braisa says, beis kor afani moichalach, one case where the seller says, I'm selling you a beis kor. Another case, he says, ki beis koraf ani meichalach, like approximately a beis koraf I'm selling you. Or a third case, he says, hein chasa, hein yeter, I'm selling you that it should be, and might be a little less or a little more. That's what I'm selling you. So then, here we apply what it said in our Mishnah, if it was less, a quarter of a calf towards a saw, or more than that amount for a saw, Higiyoi, the sale, whatever the buyer got, he got, and it's in effect. So here the Braisa brings three cases, and in all these three cases, it says this halacha that if it's a little more or a little less up to amount of the varoiva, the sale is in effect. Now, what do we see from the first case? This Braisa says, Alme stomen nami kehen chesed vehen yetedami. That in the first case of the Braisa, he told him plain, beis kor afa. And regarding this, it seems like the Braisa is also applying the same halacha that if it's a little more or a little less, that the sale is in effect. Just like if he told him clearly that it might be a little more or less. That's the way the Gemara understands. Now this Braisa says three different cases here. So the Gemara says, maybe that's not the pshat. Hossam, over there I could say in this Braisa, perushe kamefarish. The 3 points mentioned in the Braisa, it's really all one case, and the Braisa is just explaining. And this is the way you have to understand the Braisa. Ezeo beis kor shihi ki beis kor. What's the case when a person is selling someone a beis kor, but it doesn't have to be exactly a beis kor, it could be approximate, like a beis kor. That is, if he told him and spelled him out clearly that it might be less or it might be a little more, then I say that it could be approximate and it could be less or more up to the amount of a beis roiva. But if he didn't spell them out, then no, then it has to be exact. But Ravashi asks on this, he doesn't accept this answer. Maskef lo Ravashi in Cain, if he's saying that the whole Braisa, it's not three cases, it's all one case. In Cain, ani moichalach lamali. Why does the Braisa spell out twice ani moichalach? It says first beis korafar, ani moichalach, kib beis korafar, ani moichalach, henches. Why is it spelling out? If it's really all one case, like, as you explained, so then it should have said beis korafar, which is like a kib beis korafar, and that's when he said henches and henyater. It's not necessary to say each time separately, I'm selling you. Elalav, Shmami no. Therefore, Ravashi goes back to the original pshat the Gemara says, and we can learn from here. It's really three separate cases in this Braisa, and therefore I learn from here, Stama, Nami, Kehen, Chesehen, Yetedami. Even if you're just selling and saying that I'm selling you Stam, a beis kor afar, it's understood that it means approximate, and it could be a little more, a little less, up to the amount of a roiva, just like when he spelled out clearly that it could be more or less. Shmami no, it's a raya from this Braisa. Okay, now going to the next part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Ma'o machzaloi, when it was the amount of a beis roiva, so then, if it was more than a beis roiva, that is, so then you have to make a cheshbon, the Mishnah said. So Ma'o machzaloi mois v'chulu. So that Chacham will masakin for the benefit of the seller, that he doesn't give him back a small piece of field that he has nothing to do with it, but he makes a cheshbon of the extra amount, the surplus that he got, then he has to pay the seller more money for this. Now, so here the Gemara understands that this is all for the benefit of the seller. What do we see from our Mishnah? That we say that for the benefit of the seller, he does not have to take back the small piece of field. He takes more money from him for the surplus that the buyer got. But on the other hand, to say that what's if the Likeach says that he doesn't want to keep this field, he doesn't need it. Why should he have this little field where the seller here is going to come walk around near his field? You gave me an extra piece. I don't want this extra piece here. Take it, again, what's if the buyer says that he wants to keep the piece of field or he doesn't want to keep it for the benefit of the buyer. What's if we don't say for the benefit of the buyer that he also has the option to say that he wants the piece of field or he doesn't want the piece of field. We only say here for the benefit of the seller that he shouldn't have something which is too small to take back. But is that true? In a brisa that we learned, piches shivas kavin umechze lokor. If the amount that the buyer got less, if he got less than what he was supposed to get, and the amount less was 7.5 kav to the amount of a kor, or he got extra in the sale, the field that he bought, he got extra 7.5 kav for a kor, he giyoi. So that less or extra that he got, it stays as is, whatever he got is, because, as I mentioned before, the ratio of a half a kav to a saw, when it comes to a kor, which is 30 saw, it's going to be 7.5 kav for the kor. So over here, this is mechila, and therefore whatever you got, he got. Now, if it's yaisim mikan, then the brisa says if it's more than this amount, kaifin esamaycher limkar, we force the seller to sell to the buyer. If the buyer says, I want to have this extra piece of field, we force the seller to sell it to him. And we also force the buyer to buy. So over here, in this brisa, we see that it actually goes both ways. Just like the brisa says in the second point, it says, we force the buyer to buy the extra amount, and he can't give back the seller a small piece of field. It also says that we force the seller to sell as well if it's for the benefit of the buyer. So over here we see that there's a takana also for the benefit of the buyer that the seller is forced to sell for him. So why is the Mishnah only saying not to sell it to this buyer, to sell it to him? Yeah, to sell it to him for his benefit, for the benefit of the buyer if he wants it. So why is the Mishnah saying only that the Chachamim made a takana for the benefit of the seller, that he doesn't have to take the field back, and then he take only yasa cheshbin, that he only takes money back, he doesn't want such a small field back. So the Gemara answers, no. Really, the pshat even in this brisa is, Chachamim only made the takana for the benefit of the seller. But Hossam over there, in that Mishnah, when it says, Kaifan es hamaycha limkar, what that means is, Kogai da avi yekire meikara. What it's saying is, that if the case here is that the field was first a higher price, it was more expensive, and the result, hashta, and now it became cheaper. So in this case, if the seller wants the buyer to pay extra for that extra piece of field that he got, so now the price went down, the amrina and lay, so we say to the seller, I'are yavasli havli kizula da hashta. If you're giving him now this piece of field, this extra piece of field that you're selling him now, you have to give it to him according to the cheap price that it is now. That's what it means here when it says kaifin. So really the takana is all for the benefit of the seller. That is that the buyer cannot say to the seller, here, take back this little piece of field that was extra. No, because then what's the seller going to do with it? It's a small piece of field. So the buyer must buy it. But the price, what price does he pay for it? That the price is saying that we force the seller to give him the price that there is for this piece of field now. If now the price went down, it's cheaper, he's going to have to take from him the cheaper price from what it's now and not the more expensive price that he paid for the whole field before. That's the kaifin, only regarding this detail of the price. In fact, the Gemara, is that really the case, that we go according to the price the way it's now? But Vatanya, we learned in the Braise, Keshu Noisin Loi, when the seller gives him this extra piece of field, Noisin Loi, Kishar Shalokach Mimenu. So he gives it to him according to the price that it was when he bought the whole entire field from the beginning. Meaning that we do go according to the price in the beginning. So how can you say here that if the price went down, now it's cheaper that the buyer buys this extra piece of field for the lower price? It says that you have to give the price for whatever it was before when he bought the whole field from him. So the Gemara answers, no, there it's actually speaking in the opposite case. Hossam, over there the case is, Kagai in the Avazula Meikara. In the beginning the price was cheaper when he bought the whole property. And now, now it became more expensive. And now the buyer says, you want me, Dafka, to buy this extra piece of field there? Chachamim made a takana for your benefit that I'm not going to give you back this little piece of field, you can't do anything with it, but you want me to buy this piece of field now? I'm buying it in the cheaper price that it was before. Meaning, as you see here, the pshat in the Gemara is that it's always going to go, as far as the price is concerned of what this buyer has to pay for this extra piece of field there, it's always going to be to the benefit of the buyer. If there was a cheaper price in the beginning, and now it got more expensive, he pays the cheaper price. If it was a more expensive price in the beginning and now it's cheaper, he pays the cheaper price now. Chachamim made a takana here. This is a takana for the benefit of the takana is for the benefit of the seller, that he doesn't have to take back this little piece of field. But they only made that takana in a oifen where the seller, or where the buyer that is, does not lose out. When the buyer is not going to have to pay a different price than the cheaper price, either the cheaper price from before or the cheaper price now. If it's going to be something which is going to be more expensive for him, then he doesn't have to buy it from him. That's the pshat in these two brises over here. Okay, going back now to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Sheim shir besode beis tes kabim v'chulum," that if you have in a field the amount of 9 kav, so that's already a significant amount. 9 kav is something that you can take and plant and use, and therefore, in such a case, the takana that they made, that yasa cheshbon, which means that the buyer just pays money. He makes the cheshbon and he pays extra money to buy the field, and he can't give back, does not apply once it comes to the amount of 9 kav. Once it's 9 kav, so then in such a case, we say that he can give back the field to the seller. On this, so Rav Huna says, Tes kav v'shomru. When it says in the Mishnah, this amount of 9 kav, what does this mean, this amount of 9 kav? How large of a field is he selling him? That means, v'afile bebika gedola. Even if it's in a very, very big valley, it's a big field, let's say it's more, the Mishnah spoke about a person that was selling a kor. And even if he sold him much more than a kor, let's say he sold him 2 kor. And it was an extra that he gave him in the sale. How much extra did he give him? 9 kav. If he gave him extra 9 kav, that extra 9 kav, the seller is not meichel, and he has to give it back to the seller. Now, what's the chiddush of what Rav Huna is saying here? The shear of 9 kav, if he's selling him 2 kor, that amount of 9 kav is really, if you look at each kor separately, it's going to be less than the amount that we say that a person is meichel, this amount. What did we say before? What's the amount that a person is meichel when he gives extra for a kor of karka that he's selling? It's 7.5 kav, that is, per kor. That's the amount that if you gave extra, up to that amount, the person is meichel. Right? So if it's 2 kor, so twice 7.5 should be 15 kav, 15 roiva of a kav, that is. It's not a kav, it's a roiva of a kav. Did I say kav meant a roiva of a kav? That's what it said in the Mishnah. Again, let me say again. The roiva is by a sa'ah, right? By a sa'ah, the amount is a roiva. By a kor, the amount is 7.5 kav per kor. If that's extra, up to that amount is mechila. So let's say it's 2 kor, it would be the amount of 15 kav for 2 kor that you say up to that amount the person's meichel. So now what Rav Huna is saying is, let's say you sold 2 kor, let's say you even sold 10 kor. If you sold 10 kor, there could be much bigger amount of extra, much more than 9 kav, that would still be considered to be mechila. If you go by that ratio of extra, 7.5 kav per kor, so if you're selling 10 kor, it's going to come out to be much more than 9 kav. But nevertheless, Rav Huna says, what the Mishnah is saying over here is that once it comes to the amount of 9 kav, because 9 kav is a significant piece of a field that can be planted separately, even if you sold a huge amount, 10 kor, but once there's extra, just 9 kav, there's no mechila on that. 9 kav automatically is a significant piece of a field that you're going to have to give back to the seller. That's the chiddush of Rav Huna. However, Rav Nachman disagrees. Rav Nachman says, Noisen shivas kavan umechze l'chol kur kur. We go by that ratio of what mechila is for every kor separately. Just like we said in the Mishnah, that if it's a sa'ah, then the amount of extra that a person is meichel is a reiva of a kav. If it's a kor, the amount of extra a person is meichel is 7.5 kav. If there's 2 kors, then it's twice that amount. If it's 3, 4, you always go up with that amount of 7.5 per kor. It doesn't matter, even if it's much more than 9 kavim, and that's a significant piece of the field, but it doesn't matter. We always go by the amount of 7.5 kav extra per kor is what a person is meichel. That's Rav Huna's shitah. And therefore, v'i ikke milse yiseire, Letishas kavin hadri. Only if and when you have a little bit more than the amount of 7.5 kav, which is that maximum that a person is meichel. So if it's a little bit more than 7.5 kav, and because now it's the amount of 9 kav in total for let's say 10 core that you sold, and now you have or maybe a 2 core, 10 core, whatever it may be, but because it was more than 7.5 kav per core that was extra, and now the total amount that you have extra here is the amount of 9 kavin that you have to give back to the seller. And so this is the point there of Nachman is saying that you always still go by that ratio of 7.5 kav per core. Okay, the chiddush over here is, as the Rashbam explains, even though usually we say that between the amount of 7.5 kav and the amount of 9 kav, so this is the amount where the Mishnah said Yasa Cheshbin, that you don't have the ability to force the seller to take back the field. You have to make a cheshbon, and you have to pay him for that extra piece of field because it's too small. But over here, since it's already the amount of 9 kav, even if it's just a little bit more than 7.5 extra, which there's no mechila for, the seller is not meichel, you're going to have to give it back. You have the right to give it back to the seller. Okay, so now the Gemara asks Rav Nachman, what did it say in our Mishnah? She'im shir bisodeh, if you have extra in a field that you bought, based tishras kabin, the amount of 9 kabin, what did the Mishnah say? That in such a case, extra 9 kabin, you have to give it back to the seller. So what does this mean? The Mishnah doesn't say how large the whole field that you were selling was. So Lav, don't you think this means the Zavan le Kurayim, even if you're selling him a big field, even if it's 2 core? Meaning, even if you sold him 2 core, so if you sold him 2 core and there's an extra amount of 9 kav, so that means that it's still the amount that's much less than the mechila that should have been here. It's less than 7.5 kav per core. But nevertheless, the Mishnah is saying once it comes to the amount of 9 kav, that's a significant field that you have to give back to the seller. So that's exactly like Rav Huna said. That you don't say that there has to be a mechila up to the amount of 7.5 per each core. No, once it comes to the amount of 9 kav, then it doesn't matter how large of a field you sold. 9 kav, you always have to give back. That's what it seems like the Mishnah is saying. Says the Gemara law, that's not the pshat in our Mishnah. Even though the Mishnah didn't spell out the amount that you're selling, like it did in the Reisha, but over here as well, just like in the Reisha, the case is the Zavalei core. You're selling him only 1 core. And when you sell 1 core, over here you say that if it's 7.5 extra, there's mechila. If it's more than 7.5, then you have to make a cheshbon. You have to pay the moicher extra for what you're getting. And once it's 9, then 9 you just give back because that's an amount that's significant enough that the seller could use it and you give it back to him. Gemara goes through the same discussion regarding the next two points the Mishnah said. Ubegina, when it comes to a garden, over here, what's a significant piece of a field for a garden? Beis chatzi kav. If it's an area of a half a kav. For a saw, that is, to the ratio for a saw. So Lav, don't you think the Mishnah didn't spell out clearly a saw? So don't you think the Zavan le Sasayim, even in a case where he sold him 2 saw, nevertheless, in such a case, I say that if there's a chatzi kav over here, nevertheless, you're going to have to give back to the seller this half a kav. What this means is, again, going back to the point that we said before, what's the amount that a person is meichel a roiva, a base roiva for a saw? So over here, if you have a chatzi kav for a sasayim, it's still an amount that a person is meichel. For 2 saw, a half a kav, that means that for each saw, there's a roiva. A quarter of a kav, that should still be an amount that a person is meichel. But what does the Mishnah say? That a half a kav, so don't you think the Gemara says because the Mishnah doesn't spell out the amount, so it could be even a half a kav for sasayim, for 2 saw, and I say that that's big enough that you always have to give it back, no matter what. Even if it comes out to be the amount of a roiva per saw, it doesn't matter, you still have to give it back, exactly like Rav Huna said, and this is a question out of Nachman. Says the Gemara over here as well, Loi, that's not the case. Rather, the Zavan le Sa'ah. The case is, like what the Mishnah spoke about before, that he sold him 1 Sa'ah, and for that 1 Sa'ah, there was a half a kav that was extra, and that's an amount that a person is not moichel, and it's significant enough to be used for a garden, and you have to give it back to the seller. The third thing, then the Mishnah continued and said, the Kedivre Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, Beis Roiva. If it's an amount of a Beis Roiva, that's significant enough that you can give it back to the seller. So again, the Gemara says, my love, regarding this case, don't you think the case here is the Zavan Le Sa'ah, that he sold him a Sa'ah? Since we said right before this that the previous case was talking about a Sa'ah, probably this case is also a case of a Sa'ah. If it's a case of a Sa'ah, a Roiva to a Sa'ah is still a case that you're Meichel. So why is the Mishnah saying that you have to give this back to the seller? Probably the reason is, like Rav Huna said, because once it comes to a certain amount that's significant, which according to Rabbi Akiva by a garden is a Beis Roiva for a garden, so then you're going to have to give that back. Even though usually the amount of Beis Roiva is what you're Meichel, but by a garden, that's significant enough that the seller wants it back. You can use it, so you have to give it back. Exactly like Rav Huna said. So again, the Gemara says, no, loy, over here the case is the Zavan Le Chatzi Saw. He sold him a half a saw, and therefore the Beis Roiva extra that he got is double the amount. It's more than the amount of Mechila. Mechila in such a case by a half a saw would be only an eighth of a kav, which is half of a quarter of a kav. And therefore over here, it was a quarter of a kav that he gave him extra, and therefore you're going to have to give it back to the seller. So there's no question on Rav Nachman from what it said in the Mishnah. By Ravashi had a shaila here. We're talking about the two different shiurim regarding a sadeh and regarding a garden, a gina. At what point do you say that it's big enough that you have to give it back to the seller as is, and you don't have to make a cheshbon with him? So the question is, what's if it was a sadeh? When it was sold, this place was a field that was designated to plant grain in it. And then v'nasa gina. Later, Nasa's gina, it changed, and then it became a place that's a condition of a garden. The Rashbam explains a garden is a place that has to have water in it, a mayan of water in it. It has to have a water canal in it. Rashbam brings the pasuk regarding a garden that says v'ishkisa b'raglacha kegan hayerek. So it changed. It became a place where there was more water, and now it's made for a garden. Or the opposite, gina v'nasa sada. If it was first a garden, and now it became a field. There was no water there anymore. It dried up, and now it's a field. What's the halacha? What shear, when we say here, this significant amount of a size that the buyer gives back the seller, and he can use it as is because it's significant. Do you go by the shear it was in the beginning? For example, if it was a sada in the beginning, do you go by the shear of a 9 kav for a sada, or do you go by the shear for a field, which is according to the Tanakama, a half a kav? Or in the opposite, which shear do you go by? Teiku, this remains unresolved. Now, another halacha, the Gemara adds from a Braisa regarding this halacha that if it's a small field and Chachamim were masakin for the benefit of the seller, that you don't give him back that extra piece of field, but you just pay him and you have to buy that extra piece. However, Tana, in the Braisa we learned, if that extra piece of field, even though it's very small, but it's very close, it's right near the field of the seller, then afila kolshu, even if it's a very small amount, machsale karka. The buyer can give him back the field. He doesn't have to make a cheshbon with him and buy off that extra from him, because even though it's a very small piece of field, but it's right near his other karkais, so the seller can use it together with his other karka that he has. On this Rav Ashi asked, if the seller has another field right near it, but there's a pit that separates, is that pit enough that would separate, and therefore you can't say that even a small amount he can give back to the seller? Or another shaila, amasamayim ma'asha tafsik, a water canal. Would that be a hefsik? The Rashbam says, if we're going to say that a boyer is not a hefsik, but if it's a bigger hefsik, like a water canal, would that be considered to be a hefsik? And if this is not a hefsik, the question is, derech harabim ma'asha tafsik. What if there's a derech of a rabbim passing by over there? Would that be considered to be a hefsik? And that's a derech which is 16 amos wide. That's a pretty big hefsik. Would that be a hefsik to say that now you can't give him back a small piece of field because it doesn't combine with the rest of the karka that the seller has, because there's a derech harabim in between? Or furthermore, richve de dikla ma'asha tafsik. Even if the derech harabim is not a hefsik, but if you have a row of palm trees that creates an even bigger hefsik, would that be a hefsik? Teiku, this also remains unresolved. Going back to the Lashon of the Mishnah said that in a case where the extra that you got was more than the amount of mechila, more the amount of a quarter of a kav for a saw, so you have to now give back the seller everything, including not only that extra more amount, but even the actual reiva itself, which usually is mechila, you have to give it all back. So the Lashon of the Mishnah was, not only the quarter of the kav you give back, you have to give back all the extra that was more than that quarter of a kav. So the Gemara asks, as I pointed out in the Mishnah, klape lai. What the Mishnah is saying is, is going in the opposite direction. The Mishnah should be saying, for sure, you have to give back the extra amount. Not only that extra amount that there's no mechila on, but even the roiva that there usually is mechila on, you'd also have to give back. That's what the Mishnah should say. So Tani Rav Barav Nachman, the way to read in the Mishnah is, not only do you give back the extra amount, as kol harava and kulam. You have to give back whatever other amount of a quarter per saw that there is a mechila on, but in this case, once there was extra that he gave him, not as no mechila, you have to give it all back to the seller. That's how you read the Mishnah.